Welcome to the Dean's Roundtable podcast series with Bridget Johnson. Each month, we bring you game-changing conversations about K-12 education and leadership. Join us as top educators, field experts, and administrators share actionable strategies to transform your school community. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Dean's Roundtable podcast. I'm Bridget Johnson, the founder of the Dean's Roundtable, a space created for student life professionals to connect, learn, share, and grow together. Today, we're joined by Aubrey Triptow, an educational powerhouse who's worn many hats, from Chicago classroom teacher to Austin administrator to her current role coaching leaders nationwide through the Gear Leader. Her journey through education is particularly fascinating as she played a key role in developing Texas's teacher incentive allotment program while a TEA. Now based in San Antonio, Aubrey combines her passion for education with health coaching, helping leaders develop both professionally and personally. Aubrey, we're thrilled to have you here today to discuss protecting your passion, practical tips to slow down and keep your impact strong. Welcome, Aubrey, and we're going to jump right in. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey?
Yeah, so first, Bridget, thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, I think you covered a lot of it in my intro. I started born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, was teaching there, and actually came down to Austin, Texas. And that's kind of where my leadership in education, where that journey started. And I was mainly like a middle school, high school teacher. I love that age group. I feel like it's a special niche of people.
It's definitely there's
Yeah.
special people who teach middle schoolers,
Yes.
and I am not one of them, but go ahead.
I know it's either you are or you aren't. There's no
Exactly.
So I loved. I just love that age group, and I learned so much from them. But I eventually took over as a school leader, and I would say like I had wanted to be an educator my whole life, and I threw everything into it. And I learned a lot through that experience. Ended up deciding to step out, which I can talk more about in a little bit for health reasons. And I really feel like my impact is greater now, but I learned so much along that journey, which allows me now to help former or current school leaders and current teachers really like stay in that profession that they love so much. So that's kind of my dedicated work now, is just consulting and really supporting teachers and leaders.
That's awesome. So, what inspired you to focus on strategies for preventing burnout among high performers in education?
Yeah. So I think in short, which I can talk about this for hours, it's a little bit of what I touched on previously, because I was a high performer who experienced severe burnout. And I think that gives me definitely a strong foundation in being able to support and be the person I wish I had to like heal and learn from that process. And I would say like ever since the moment like I could probably speak, I've dedicated my life to education. And my passion for education like just runs so deep. Like my mom was an educator. I always dreamed of being an educator. I used to sit my siblings down and like teaching them lessons on my Fisher Price. Like I remember sitting and admiring some of the great teachers I had, thinking like I'm gonna be like them one day. Like it was just never a second thought. It wasn't like a different career that I had chosen. I had always wanted to be a teacher. And my favorite teacher, she actually became a principal, which really that
Mm.
like then I knew what I really wanted. But education was more than just a job for me. I think like most of us feel that way. It's like a calling. And even during like spring breaks in college when people were going off and having fun, I was like volunteering to teach and others. So I guess that just like boils down to the fact that like I really wanted to do this. This was my deepest passion. And I really gave everything to the field and to my students. And I did this with no regard to my health. And so I advanced to those leadership roles, totally burnt out, and my body just couldn't keep up with the demands that I would say I put on myself. I ended up in the hospital. I was diagnosed with a stress disorder. And so reflecting on that experience, I realized like it wasn't just like one thing or a couple of things that like really broke me, I would say. It was like I had been burning out for such a long time, and I just
Mm.
had the tools to protect my passion, and that passion, that I had had almost my whole life. So, we need passionate educators like in our
Absolutely.
schools. And so we need the ones that like, want to change students' lives. But they also like as educators, you deserve to be healthy and like whole. And so I've made it my mission and like the core of my business to like support educators in that passion and like preventing burnout or in making sure that they're either if they're already there, that they're healing from that. And so since that decision that I made, I pretty much have like immersed myself in research. I pretty much read every book you can, stress management and burnout, and just I've interviewed countless educators. I've been like coaching and consulting with like, districts or with like one-on-one with leaders with teachers. And I even like for my own healing journey, I became like certified in holistic health. So my commitment to like supporting them will just really continue to guide every single thing I do. And so I would say that is definitely the inspiration and where this comes from. It's just like it's now my new life's work.
Awesome. And so I want to go back just for a second. You mentioned that, you burnt out to the point and you found yourself in the
Yeah.
hospital. Was that the actual turning point, or did it still take you a little while after that to realize that I've got to do something different? Like, how quickly did you make that pivot?
I wish I could say like that was the full
Huh?
absolutely I think it was about 6 months, maybe 6 to 8 months after that, then I finally like had decided because I was so immersed in it, it's your whole life. It's part of your
Right.
like your identity.
Yeah,
And I just didn't want to give that up. Like I didn't know who I was without that, career. So it was hard,
I do.
so hard. And so yeah, I would say it
Now,
definitely took me a while.
well, because you worked so hard to get there, and then you put yourself in the hospital, but then you're like, "Oh my gosh, now I've gotta catch up," right? Because that's kind of what I would have thought initially back when I had some also unhealthy habits, and so I was just curious if it kind of ended there for you, and you're like, "Nope, I'm done. I'm gonna kind of turn over a new leaf and take my, health, make it more of a priority," or did it take you a little while? And I think it's okay for us to say that because that's the reality. We don't wanna kind of sugarcoat this and say, "Oh, and then I realized that, there's so many better ways to do this." When you've been doing something like that for so long, it's really hard to, like, kinda turn that switch off,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term, and so we talked about you being in the hospital and not knowing kind of what was happening with you then and when you made the decision to kind of turn things around or do something a little bit differently. Talk about that time for you.
Yeah. So it wasn't the brightest time of my life, but I would say I don't think I really recognized like even the term burnout at that time wasn't even something that was like in my mind. I remember I was like Googling and researching and trying to find, and I found like a YouTube video where someone had actually used that exact word. And that was honestly the first time that I think I actually related that to what I was going through. But
Wow.
yeah, and I think you're in the weeds so deeply that I think you don't really always recognize what's going on and you can't really identify it. So if you're not sure if you're burning out, I actually like have a whole Instagram dedicated to like identifying the signs of burnout because I think when if you've been living in a state of like never ending stress and you're exhausted all the time, I think, you're probably there. And also, if you're listening to this, you've probably already started to identify some of the things, but there's a lot of things that you wouldn't think of because you're like, oh, I'm just high performing. That's part of this season or whatever it is. And so you want to recognize that as soon as you can so you can get ahead of it. And so you're not so far down the line that you end up in the hospital. That's like my worst fear for anyone. And so I think like, yeah, taking the time to really recognize like where you are in that process is also really helpful.
Yeah, and so you mentioned prioritizing ruthlessly, which I think is an awesome term because you do have to prioritize and take care of what's most important. But how can teachers and school leaders decide what's most important when everything feels so urgent?
Yeah. And I think we use that word like, oh, prioritize, prioritize. And I feel like if you don't actually know how, like, you need to really learn how. It's not,
Yeah, absolutely.
especially when you feel like everything's up at the top. I think, and also, I think another thing I've realized with prioritization is a lot of us prioritized and figured this out years ago. And now we have different lives. Like things have changed from when we first started teaching or leading and like but we haven't reevaluated our priorities. So I'll say that first. Like you may have like, that plan 10 years ago is no longer working. You need to adjust that. But I would say if I were to give you like a cheat sheet on how to prioritize as an educator, I think first is like student and staff safety is like over everything. So anything
Right.
concerning safety is like, it seems obvious, but I think sometimes you just need to say it. Like that's always going to be number one. And
Right.
then the second thing I think is asking, like, will this significantly impact student outcomes? And sometimes the answer really is no. Like it feels like it might, it feels really urgent, but like, is this really going to? And sometimes the answer is no. And then that really shouldn't be in your like at least your top 3 priorities. And so just have asking those questions is, and as a school leader, sometimes it's like you have to shift and focus on a different initiative or really ask yourself, like, is this directly impacting my student achievement or my teacher's like well-being? And sometimes like you got to let go of it, even though like it seems like so essential at the time, it may not be. And you may need to, or maybe it is, and it just needs to be delayed. But I think that's always a good question to ask yourself because you have to make space for what truly matters. And sometimes we want to like add more things instead of getting right the things we do have, even though like really focusing in on like being consistent with that thing, we feel like, oh, we just need to keep adding on this, adding on when really, no, we need to focus in on those. So those are just like good things to think through. I would say like everything else, you got to write it down and take a critical look at it. I think at one point I wanted to make some extra money, as you do in education. And I
Yes.
took, like, another after school like club or something. And I ended up like using, and when I was reevaluating my priorities, I was like, I want to be healthy, right? Like, you want to be healthy.
Yeah.
And I was looking and I was like spending that money on a dog walker for my dog, but cheap in Austin, Texas. And I was like spending a chunk of that money on dog walkers and then like fast food or some sort of meal delivery. And like I'm all for like outsourcing chores, but that was like backwards in my priorities. And I think unless I really sat down and realized like I'm actually overextending myself and then spending money on things that are not like nowhere in my priority list, that's when I started thinking like I need to trim some things down. So I think just writing those things down could be huge. I think even as a school leader, like doing that with your staff, but so
Absolutely.
like probably a really helpful way to get, you know, cut out what doesn't need to be the focus.
Yeah, I think we underestimate how the importance of writing things down and just taking a look at them because we have all these things in our head and we feel like, things are so chaotic and you have so many things going on. But I find for myself, if I take a minute and write things down and look at all the things I feel like I have to do, one, it's easier to prioritize that way. But two, sometimes it feels like, oh, it's not as much as I thought. And so you kind of get out of your own way by being able to do that.
No, 100%. Yeah, I would say, and like, yeah, I'd say like we always think, oh, I'll write this down. I write this down. I'm like, not in the way that's knocking things down or taking them off the list or delegating. Sometimes that's all,
Yeah.
right?
No, delegation is super important. That's a great segue into my next question in terms of, kind of setting boundaries at work. And a lot of times it's easier said than done in education, especially when it comes to students, because you feel like, you don't want to let students down or you want to give them the best experience that you can. And so, can you give examples of how teachers and school leaders can set boundaries without feeling guilty or feel like they're neglecting their responsibilities?
Yeah, the word guilt. The minute you said it, I was like, oh, I
Yeah,
see what that
absolutely.
so
Educator
yeah,
guilt is a real thing.
like built into the culture, right? And I
Yep.
think we also like often glorify like overworking and and I think we need to shift our mindset towards like building like but like setting boundaries is what is so crucial for sustainability really in any career. Like it's not just educators, but especially educators. I think for teachers, that's sometimes like clearing, like making sure that you have a clear time to leave school, like every day. And I think sometimes we get, we just forget to say that like I have to leave at this time. Like, there's some days you have after school activities, but other than that, like I will put this on my to-do list for my planning time tomorrow or for whatever. I'll leave that on my desk and actually be able to like mentally release yourself, leave that to-do list and not take that home with you as many
Yeah.
as you can. I think that's like, you're still going to do it, but it's just like within a way that's like relieving yourself of that for the night or whatever.
Yes.
And then, yeah, that mental stress when you carry home, I think is sometimes part of a boundary that we struggle to create for ourselves.
Yeah, and it's tricky, and, I'm thinking about, you've talked about, teachers being able to leave things on their desks and go home. I also want to address because some of our audience work in boarding schools, and so I worked in boarding schools for 15 years, and I used to call it home sweet work because there's a real blurry line between home and work, and so thinking about how you carve out that time for yourself, whether it's just like you physically getting off campus. Sometimes you just have to physically get off campus, but other times you can set boundaries by just saying, you know what, folks, I am not available at this time. And, kind of drawing that line in the sand and say, please respect my time, even though I am on campus. And so I just wanted to kind of put a plug in for that for those boarding school
And I
folks as
think for
well, because
yeah,
uh, it definitely it can, and you feel that additional tug when you're living amongst the students as well. So you wanna make sure that you can figure out some ways, whether it's, taking on or having a hobby that's off campus away from the fray so that you can, relax, release, relate, as they say, and, find some time for yourself. But it's, can be particularly difficult for folks who live at schools and feel like they can't escape, for lack of a better term.
no, no, absolutely. And I think for I like, yeah, I think for school leaders, like, and even, I mean, staff, I think you can impact like the rest of your team or whomever, but I think it's about if you were to pretend that like it's your job to model what that looks like, sometimes that's helpful, but like not sending emails after a certain time, because then I think the rest of your team is no longer having to check their email at 8 or 9 p.m. Like they know that like that's a boundary that you've set for yourself, but also for them. So like they can kind of like check out for a little while.
Yeah.
Well,
No, absolutely.
and like and even
Yep.
encouraging them to like be like, hey, I actually don't want you. If there's an
Yep.
emergency, I used to say like, I will call you on your cell phone if there's an
Yep.
emergency. But other than that, like,
Exa
an emergency would be like safety, but also
exactly.
that that's my boundary. Uh,
No, for sure, and modeling that is so important because if you're not exhibiting that behavior, then your faculty or staff or whoever reports to you don't feel like they can either, and so that's another kind of layer of guilt. If you feel like you see your boss is always working, then you feel guilty about the taking the time away, even though it's important for you and healthy for you to do so.
no, absolutely. So, so true. And then I think that we also have to think of like taking care of yourself is not neglecting your responsibilities. Like
Exactly, yes.
like
It is
fully
not.
now, but I'm like, oh, back then, like I would be like, I almost would feel so guilty for doing anything outside of like even school hours. I was like, this is means I'm not as dedicated. Like,
I always say, and people who know me hear me say this often, you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you can be helpful to others. And so that includes, really taking care of yourself, right? So that you can be there for your students and not burn out, right? And so that's,
yeah,
oh, go ahead. What were you
I was
saying?
gonna say for that oxygen mask too, if you have been in doing this for 10 years or 20 years or however long and you're so not in the habit of putting the oxygen mask on, you're gonna have to give yourself a little while. Like it's not going to
Yeah.
your thing. Like you're going to have to actually take some time to like relearn how to do that or learn maybe for the first time how to do it
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, it's not a natural reflex for us, and we do have to, like, actually maybe sometimes physically say it out loud, like, "I am gonna take a break,"
More about
and walk away, right? Sometimes you just gotta walk away, but for those teachers who feel like they can't slow down without compromising student success, we're talking about, the lives of our youth here, the children are our future, right? What would you say to help them rethink their approach? Because there are people out here who think they really cannot take a break.
yeah. I think about a lot of times I'll think of athletes because I think like teaching and being an educator feels like a marathon sometimes. If
Absolutely.
they never rested or they never took a day to like really take care of themselves and like did things throughout the week, like stretching or eating healthy or all of that, like we wouldn't make it. And so why are we different? It's like I think that slowing down is not compromising student success. And I think the one thing I wish someone would have said to me is like when you burn out, you your like ability to be effective and even be in this role is going to diminish. Like it's going to go
Mhm.
away. And you did not go through all that schooling and
Eggs and all that hard
all
work,
the
exactly.
obligations and everything to get to this career to not be. that fully amazing educator that you have like trained yourself and worked so hard to be. And so like slowing down is essential. Like that's it. Like it's not selfish. It's actually like that's what keeps you energized. It's what gives you patience with students. You ever feel those days where you're like, just like, nope. But then like
Yeah.
reason why you feel so impatient, like, and like, and then also your ability to be creative and like all of those things that directly benefit your student. You have to remember like that is, you have to slow down. Like you have to rest.
You have to slow down. Yes, and I like that analogy about the athlete. As someone who was an athlete, you have to recover just as hard as you work out. And so taking those recovery days seriously is something you had to do, whether it's like you said, stretching or getting a massage or doing an ice bath
Yeah.
or just, cross training. Like you have to do, you cannot work out hard 7 days a week. You're not going to make it. You're going to overtrain, you're going to hurt yourself, all the things. So I appreciate the analogy because I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah. And I think we always say like, oh, but there's one, the schedule's so piled on top of each other, like there's just not enough time. But like, I think that that was something I put in my own head. Like, there really isn't 5 minutes for you to walk outside and like let the sun hit your face.
Exactly.
Well, there's and sometimes like there isn't, then like that's something like you think you need to get feedback on and work on. But like, I do think that there were some things I had in my head, like I can't. And it's like, you actually can, like you can. And so you need to like figure out those little breather times as like a leader and as a teacher because your career depends on it, like quite literally.
Yeah, literally. And so we talked a little bit earlier about the importance of modeling healthy habits for your team to create a culture where taking breaks is seen as valuable rather than a sign of weakness. So, what do you say to that leader who says that, my team can take breaks, but I can't?
Yeah. I think this was something I actually did love about being a school leader. Obviously, I could have done better. But I know that I remember thinking like I can set the tone for the healthy work culture. Like it's finally up to me. Like I've made it to the level where like I can put out that tone or like set the temperature for what that feels like on my campus. And I did this, but I excluded myself. So like like don't make sure you're included because like modeling is actually like the most impactful if we think about it. Like you can literally trick yourself into taking care of yourself by modeling those healthy habits. Like, oh, I have to do this for my staff. I have to,
Yep.
I have to take breaks. I have to like, be open about the fact that I'm shutting off my computer at this time. And I think that, yeah, just letting them know that you're actually recharging or stepping away and encouraging them to do the same is just so huge, and you can almost trick yourself into doing it as well. But yeah, and like actually normalize that within your
Mm, yeah, normalizing that is really important. So let's get practical
yeah,
here. What are some small but impactful changes an educator can make today to start feeling less
yeah.
overwhelmed?
So it sounds like you've probably heard this before, but I think the first thing you could do is like audit your calendar or like assess your calendar. You have life outside of work, you have your like work, which is, a lot, and you need to just audit it. Because like I said, I think not just the school day or just the weekdays, like you need to audit before school, school day, after school, during the weekends, and even during your vacation days. And like ask yourself, like, is this aligned with how you gain energy, right? There's going to be some things that drain your energy, right? Like maybe teaching math like 8 periods in a row may not be fruitful your butt.
May not.
Well, what are you doing to like what are those things that actually fill up your bucket? And sometimes that right then and there can tell you like, oh, there's really nothing refilling my bucket. Okay, well, you need
Yeah.
to start there. But I think if you have a section like this is what drains my energy that I can actually get rid of, or like, you can't get rid of teaching 8 periods in a row. Like that's but
Mhm.
can include some of those things that refill your bucket because I think or like refill your cup. I think if we're not really intentional, I think we'd realize, like, for me, I remember thinking, like, I'm just doom scrolling for an hour before I fall asleep when I actually desperately need that rest. Or, just to kind of give myself some me time when, like, there's actually things that can be me time that are way more like healthy and like really re energizing and all those things. And it's just by writing that down and looking at my calendar I started realizing like this is what is aligning to me feeling good versus me feeling like I'm just in a cycle of, you know, of being exhausted taking on more work, feeling good for a little bit, and then going back into that. The other thing you can do is we all have, like I said, like there's this passion and this reason why you went into this career to begin with, right? There's a reason why you love this work. There's a reason why you show up for those students. And I think we tend to forget that in the day-to-day work.
Hmm.
I think you need to make it a point to like find something within your day that brings that joy. And you know that person who's been in teaching forever and ever and ever. They're
Yeah.
and the ones that you can tell like don't want to be there, and the ones
Yeah.
I'm just seem like just so caring, all the students love, like they find joy, whether it be in another staff member doing something cool, whether it be in a student, whether it be in just anything that happened during the day. And sometimes it's jotting that down. Maybe it's sending a thank you to someone or whatever, complimenting a student, whatever that is, or shouting someone out. Like you just need to like re-spark that inside of you. And that is something you can do so easily every day without much thought that can really bring back that energy and that spark inside you. And you do that for a few weeks, and I'm telling you, it will. I've seen some cool changes. And then kind of going from that into the third thing that I've worked with a lot of um, leaders and teachers on is checking your mindset around like, and even the mindset, like how you're impacted by others. So like there will be
Hmm.
comments like, who are you sitting with at staff PDs? And like, I remember someone was coaching that staff PDs are the worst thing ever. And so we like dug deeper into this like mindset, and they actually had lacked development in their previous district. Like they never were developed. So now you're finally getting developed and you're like very upset about this or whatever, you know? And then they started laughing. They were like, you know what, you're right. It's just like 1 hour, like every week, like, or whatever. And it was just talking through that. And they were like, I'm sitting with a group of people that just really don't want to be here. And I'm like, hey, that's okay. And sometimes those PDs really aren't that like impactful,
Mm.
right? And so that's some feedback you
Yeah.
can give. But like, this is how you can manage your internal experience. And you have the power to change the tone in the room, like more than you think. And so sometimes it's just like, if you look at your calendar, try to spark that passion, and then you just think through like, what's really bothering me? What's upsetting me? And like, let's put it back into perspective and like move from that space. And those are just like things that you don't have to do a heavy lift. I would say like besides auditing your calendar, really the rest are pretty low lift.
Yeah, that I like that. And so, Aubrey, if you don't mind me asking, so after you came out of that kind of burnout period, and there was still a period of time before you made that kind of switch or transition, what were some of the first things you did to kind of change things for you or kind of change your life to be more healthier, more kind of taking time for yourself?
Yeah. So one of the things I had found out when I was in the hospital was like I really wasn't sleeping. One of the biggest things I did was get more sleep. And you really can, like even if it's an hour, it's like an hour and a half, like it really makes a big difference. And I feel like that helped my stress levels. I also found a way to help with my own mindset and my own like mindfulness. I think taking some time to just like be quiet, even if it's like you wake up 10 minutes earlier, to just take that time, whatever that means for you, was so powerful for me and still is. And sometimes that's just like movement, like in a way that makes me feel good, but also it's just like quiet time just for me, like that
Mm,
10 minutes, like that.
yeah, no, that
20,
makes a
12
difference
minutes
for
is
sure.
like what they say is like transformational. And then I would say like there was being able to really like obviously support others that were going through this taught me a lot about like challenging some of the ways I was doing things. And I think honestly, thinking about how I spend my time was also very eye opening for me, and something I continue to do now. It's just like, what fills my bucket, what is in alignment with my priorities and my goals for life. And then just really trying to cut the fat of everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this was great, Aubrey. Thank you so much for your time today. I think there is some great nuggets that we can take away. And, the three things that you said earlier in terms of, what you can do to start now would be, thinking about looking at your calendar and doing an audit of your calendar, figuring out your why and what brings you joy, what fills your bucket, and thinking about your mindset. And I think all those things are super helpful when thinking about prioritizing you because that's the most important thing. We think that, everyone else is most important, but we first. have to put ourselves ahead of everyone else. And so that's why I wanted to have you on today, because I think especially folks who are, the student life professionals who are doing things kind of outside the classroom, those lines can really get blurred in terms of where their responsibilities lie. But, I think it is important to say again that responsibility lies first with making sure that you're healthy and that you're okay. And so, again, thank you so much. And just so you all know that Aubrey will be back, we're going to talk about some other topics in the upcoming weeks, whether it's, thinking about the holidays and a couple other things that we think could be important for educators in terms of just prioritizing your mindset and your mental health. So, again, Aubrey, thank you so much. And any parting words for our guests?
Yeah, I think sometimes us as educators don't hear this enough, but I think like you're so valued and like your impact that you have on students is in the school community and everything is just like immeasurable. You like support not just students, but usually their families and like you all are like the heartbeat of education. And
Absolutely.
so you all like, you really do. It's like your well-being is not like a luxury. It's essential to doing the work you do. And so just want you all to know like like so many people see that value in you. And so just to take care of yourself and be well because you're so important and valued.
Awesome. Thank you so much. What a great note to end on. And so, with that, we say thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good. See you next time.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Dean's Roundtable podcast series. If you are a student life professional looking for regular support, look no further than the Dean's Roundtable online community platform, where K-12 leaders share resources, grow their network, and get 24/7 professional support. Also, be sure to check out our monthly Dean's Roundtable office hours, where we tackle real challenges together in real time. Links to join both are in the episode description. Find all the details at deansroundtable.org. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Today's episode was hosted by Bridget Johnson in conversation with Aubrey Tripto. Produced and edited by Andrick Sigmund and music by PremiumBeat.com. For any questions, contact information can be found in the episode description. And, as always, thanks again for listening.